7 months pregnant, she stepped into the marble-floored lobby of the hospital she built from the ground up. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh paint, a reminder of the millions invested to make this place the crown jewel of her company. She expected warmth, respect. Instead, a frown met her at the front desk. "Ma'am, this facility is for premium patients only. You can't be here." The words didn't just land, they lingered. Her hand instinctively rested on her stomach. She spoke softly, evenly, but with an edge that could cut glass. "They didn't recognize me. Or maybe they did, and just didn't care." A security guard appeared, his eyes scanning her like she was a trespasser. In the distance, an elevator chimed, doors sliding shut on a group of executives who had no idea what was coming. Hours later, those same doors would open for a very different purpose. She reached for her phone, one call away from ending careers. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. That morning, she wasn't just a patient, and by the time she left, no one in that building would forget it. I was born into two worlds that rarely met, the heartbeat of a hospital ward and the grind of a corner shop counter. My mother was a nurse who worked double shifts so patients would never feel abandoned. My father ran a modest business, the kind that kept food on the table and taught me what grit really looked like. From the time I could walk, I was caught between the smell of antiseptic and the sound of my father's cash register. Both worlds taught me something. Service is sacred, and dignity is non-negotiable. I carried those lessons into med school, where I learned quickly that talent doesn't erase bias. Professors mispronounced my name while knowing every syllable of my white classmates. Patients sometimes asked if I was just the assistant before I introduced myself as the doctor. I didn't let it harden me, I let it sharpen me. Years later, I wasn't just practicing medicine. I was building an empire, a national healthcare chain that married cutting-edge technology with compassion. My flagship hospital was my pride. Top-of-the-line equipment, a staff handpicked for their skill and humanity, and policies that ensured every patient was treated like family. Or so I believed. That morning, I'd returned not as the CEO walking in with cameras for a ribbon cutting, but as a patient. 7 months pregnant. My daughter's heartbeat meant more to me than any profit margin. The pregnancy had been classified as high risk. Nothing unmanageable, but enough to keep my doctors watchful. Today was one of those essential visits where every reading, every scan mattered. The flagship hospital was the obvious choice. It wasn't just the best, it was mine. Walking through those glass doors, I expected familiarity. A nod from the receptionist I'd seen at staff meetings, a smile from a nurse who'd attended our last community outreach event. Instead, I was met with a gaze that skimmed over me like I was an intruder. I knew that look. I'd seen it in other facilities, in other cities. The one that measures you not by your title, not by your need, but by the assumptions tied to your skin. I reminded myself this was my space, my policies, my people. But the air felt different. It was as if the walls didn't remember me. I'd been in these halls hundreds of times, I thought, pausing at the reception desk, but on that day, I walked in as if I was invisible. What I didn't know, not yet, was that the next few minutes would strip away any illusions I had about how far my influence reached. And the first blow came in the form of a voice that didn't bother to hide its dismissal. If you'd like, I can now flow directly into the denial of service section, so the tension rises without a pause. That's where the real confrontation begins. Here's the 600-word denial of service section. Escalating tension, racism-aligned subtext in every interaction, no unnecessary repetition, and keeping the narrative moving toward the confrontation. The click of my heels against the polished tile echoed through the lobby as I approached the front desk. The receptionist didn't greet me. Her eyes lifted briefly, sliding over my face, then down to my stomach, before drifting back to her screen with a practiced slowness that felt more like dismissal than distraction. "Do you have an appointment?" Her tone wasn't neutral. It carried that thin edge, the kind people use when they've already decided you're out of place. I gave my full name, clear and steady. For the briefest moment, her expression shifted. The tiniest freeze, like the name had landed somewhere in her memory. But it vanished almost instantly, replaced by a frown. Her fingers tapped at the keyboard, deliberate, and then she looked back up. "We have no record of you in the system." I reached into my bag, pulled out my ID, and extended it toward her. She didn't take it. Her eyes stayed fixed on mine, her lips pressing together in something that looked less like procedure and more like defiance. "We have a certain standard here," she said, each word spaced just enough to carry meaning beyond the surface. "This isn't a public facility." The words hit harder than she probably intended, though maybe that was the point. I heard them before, in other settings, directed at other people who looked like me. A certain standard was a phrase you didn't need a dictionary to interpret. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a nurse coming down the hallway. I turned slightly toward her, hoping for recognition. She glanced at me, just long enough to register, then shifted her gaze to the floor, stepping quickly past as if I weren't there. A shadow moved to my left. A security guard had appeared, his hand resting near the radio clipped to his belt. His gaze traveled slowly from my shoes to my hair, lingering at my belly, before landing back on my face. My mind began to work in two directions. One part of me tried to rationalize. Maybe this was incompetence, a scheduling error, a misunderstanding. The other part, the part shaped by a lifetime of subtle exclusions, knew better. This wasn't about systems. This was about who they saw when they looked at me. I leaned slightly closer to the counter. "Please page Dr. Nolan," I said, giving the name of the attending physician. The receptionist tilted her head, almost as if I'd insulted her. "He's busy with real patients right now." Real patients. For a moment, the sounds of the hospital, distant monitors, muffled voices, seemed to fade. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag. I felt my daughter move, a soft reminder that this visit wasn't optional. Still, the guard shifted his weight forward, his posture communicating readiness, not help. The receptionist kept her gaze level, as if daring me to push back. I thought of the staff meetings I'd held in this very building, the speeches about compassion, dignity, equality. I thought of the funding approvals I'd signed, the raises I'd authorized, the policies I'd insisted be put in place to protect patients from exactly this kind of treatment. And here I was, standing in the center of my own creation, being treated like an intruder. This was no accident, and I was beginning to realize they weren't going to back down on their own. If you'd like, I can now take this straight into the escalation and public humiliation section, where the tension peaks and the real power shift begins. That's where the security presence intensifies, the crowd notices, and the humiliation becomes public. Would you like me to proceed? Here's the 550-word escalation and public humiliation section, keeping the tension high, weaving in the racial discrimination subtext at every turn, and making sure the pacing drives straight into the next section without ending the story. The security guard stepped closer, his voice low but laced with authority. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave before things get messy." The phrase wasn't a suggestion, it was a warning. Movement in the waiting area caught my eye. Heads turned in my direction, eyes curious, some cautious. A mother held her child a little tighter. A man in a suit leaned back in his chair, watching as if this was an afternoon distraction. Then came the whispers. Quick glances traded between strangers. A few reached for their phones, screens lighting up as lenses angled toward me. I took in a slow breath, my hand resting over the swell of my stomach. My daughter's safety came first, and I wasn't about to let this escalate into something reckless. That didn't mean I would shrink. The guard's expression hardened. "If you can't afford to be here, there's a public hospital about 15 blocks away." The words dropped into the space between us like a gavel. Not just wrong, insulting. I looked at him steadily. "This building exists because I built it. Every brick, every machine, every paycheck, and you think you can throw me out?" The receptionist's fingers froze over her keyboard. For a split second, the nurse who had avoided my gaze earlier paused mid-step. But no one spoke up. It wasn't ignorance anymore. It was defiance. They doubled down. The guard's stance widened slightly, as if bracing for me to resist. My mind raced through the optics of the moment. A black woman, visibly pregnant, being escorted out of a hospital, her hospital, by uniformed security. Cameras recording, strangers narrating. If I raised my voice, they'd frame it as aggression. If I stayed silent, they'd take it as submission. so I chose a third option. I reached into my bag, fingers wrapping around my phone. The guard's eyes flickered downward as if unsure whether to stop me. Without breaking eye contact, I swiped the screen and pressed one number. "Mark," I said when the call connected. My voice was calm, almost too calm. "I need you at the flagship. Now. Bring HR, legal, and 2 board members, and make sure they enter through the main lobby." The guard tilted his head slightly, confusion flashing in his eyes. The receptionist's frown deepened, but her shoulders stiffened, as though she was trying to hold her ground. In the waiting area, a young woman lowered her phone just enough to look at me directly. There was something in her gaze, recognition, maybe even disbelief, as if she just realized this was bigger than what it appeared to be. I ended the call and slid the phone back into my bag. My tone never shifted, but the message was clear. This was no longer their game to control. They thought they were removing a problem. They had no idea they just set the stage for their own removal. If you want, I can move directly into the power move section next. That's where Mark Alvarez arrives. The board steps in, and the hospital's leadership is confronted in real time. That's where the shift in control becomes undeniable. Here's the 800-word "the power move" section, keeping the momentum sharp, every beat aligned to the racism theme, and escalating the control shift in a way that sustains tension for the next act. It didn't take long. 15 minutes after my call, the glass doors at the entrance slid open, and in walked Mark Alvarez, my chief operating officer, flanked by our head of HR, lead legal counsel, and 2 members of the board. Their presence alone changed the air in the room. The receptionist straightened in her chair, suddenly invested in her monitor. The security guard shifted his weight, glancing toward the lobby like he was waiting for instructions. Mark didn't waste words. "Let's go," he said, his voice clipped, eyes scanning the room. He gestured toward the administrative wing, and the group moved as one. The staff stared after us, confusion and apprehension mingling in their expressions. We stopped in the security office. The head of HR requested access to the morning's CCTV footage. The guard on duty hesitated until Mark reminded him, in a tone that could cut steel, that compliance wasn't optional. The first clip rolled. There I was, stepping into the lobby, smiling faintly, my hand at my stomach. The receptionist's dismissive glance played in full color. The moment she froze after hearing my name, her lips forming the words, "We have no record of you in the system." The refusal to take my ID. The second clip showed the nurse looking directly at me before walking away. The security guard approaching, hand on his radio. His mouth forming the words, "If you can't afford to be here." Silence filled the room. No one needed narration. The footage spoke for itself. We moved to the executive conference room. I took my seat at the head of the table, the same seat I used for strategic planning meetings, budget approvals, and expansion discussions. This time, the conversation would be about accountability. Mark stood to my right, a folder in hand. "The following employees are under immediate review," he began, his tone steady but unyielding. He read out the receptionist's name, position, and employment record. Then the security guard, then the nurse. Each name felt heavier than the last. The door opened abruptly. The hospital director walked in, face flushed, tie slightly askew. "I just heard," he began. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I cut in. My voice was quiet, but it landed like a gavel. "This is systemic." He tried again, words tumbling out. "I assure you, we value diversity. This must be an isolated." "Stop." I didn't raise my voice, but the room went still. What happened to me this morning has happened to others. The only difference is, I'm in a position to address it, and I will. I turned to HR. Effective immediately, suspend the front desk clerk, the security guard, and the nurse. Paid leave pending investigation. The legal counsel leaned forward, her voice formal, each syllable deliberate. "You are being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. You will receive further instruction regarding the investigation by the end of the day." The reactions varied. The receptionist's eyes widened, her face blanching as tears welled. The security guard's jaw tightened, his hands clasped behind his back in a rigid stance. The nurse simply stared at the table, refusing to look up. Finally, the receptionist spoke, her voice shaking. "We didn't know who she was." Mark didn't even glance at her. "You knew she was a patient." The guard broke in, his tone defensive. I was just following protocol. I met his gaze. Your protocol allowed you to assume I didn't belong here. Your words told me exactly why. The nurse muttered something about being busy, about not wanting to get involved. I leaned forward, my hands clasped on the table. That's the problem. You saw someone in need of care and chose to walk away. The hospital director shifted uncomfortably, but he said nothing. Inside, my thoughts sharpened. They knew exactly who I was. The problem was, it didn't matter to them, because my skin and my pregnancy told them I didn't belong. I'd spent years crafting a mission statement about equal access to dignified healthcare. And here, in the flagship hospital that bore my company's name, that mission had been reduced to a plaque on the wall. I let the silence linger, forcing everyone in the room to sit with the weight of it. Then I spoke again, my tone final. This will not happen in any facility under my leadership again. We will rebuild trust here, and that starts with removing those who break it. Mark closed the folder with a sharp snap. HR collected notes. Legal began drafting formal notices. The meeting wasn't over, but the message was clear. The power dynamic had shifted. And as I sat there watching them file out, I knew this was only the beginning of what needed to be done. If you'd like, I can now move directly into the backstory and bigger picture section, where the narrative widens beyond this incident, touching on systemic racism in healthcare and personal history, while still keeping viewers emotionally hooked. This will bridge perfectly into her decision to turn this into lasting change. Here's the 550-word backstory and bigger picture section, connecting the incident to systemic racism in healthcare, weaving in personal and statistical context, and maintaining the emotional weight without breaking the flow. The conference room emptied, but my mind didn't. The anger simmering beneath my calm exterior wasn't just about this morning. It was about every time I'd seen this pattern repeat itself in places meant to heal. I'd walked into hospitals before as a doctor, as a CEO, and yes, even as a patient, and I'd felt that shift in tone, that measuring gaze. I'd heard stories from Black women across the country, women with platinum insurance cards, impressive resumes, and spotless credit, who were still met with suspicion at the front desk or indifference in the exam room. The setting changed, the excuses varied, but the outcome was the same. Their care was delayed, their dignity questioned. Statistics had always been part of my work, but today, they felt personal. Black maternal mortality rates in the United States are 2 to 3 times higher than those of white women. Not because of biology, because of bias. Because pain is underestimated, symptoms are dismissed, and concerns are brushed aside. I thought about the women I'd met at advocacy events, mothers who had nearly died during childbirth because someone ignored their distress. Some never made it home at all. And then I thought of my own mother. She'd gone into labor with me on a rainy Tuesday night. The nurse on duty barely glanced at her chart, waved her off when she said the pain was unbearable. She lay there, gripping the bed rail, begging for medication. Hours later, when the doctor finally arrived, he was startled by how far her labor had progressed. "We should have prepped you sooner," he'd said, as if it were just an oversight. My mother carried that story for years, repeating it not out of bitterness, but as a warning. Her experience wasn't an exception. It was part of a long, quiet tradition of being told to wait, to endure, to prove you were worthy of care. I'd built my company to be the opposite of that, a place where no one, regardless of color or income, would have to fight to be seen. And yet, here I was, in my own flagship hospital, being told I didn't belong. If this can happen to me, with all my power, I let the thought hang in my mind. What happens to women without it? The answer was one I didn't want to imagine, because I already knew it. I looked down at the curve of my belly, at the life I was carrying. This wasn't just about my reputation, my authority, or even my safety. This was about making sure my daughter never had to sit in a waiting room and wonder if the color of her skin outweighed the value of her health. The resolve settled in my chest like stone. This wasn't going to be handled quietly. This wasn't just about me anymore. If you want, I can now move straight into the turning scandal into change section, where the focus shifts from reaction to action. Public acknowledgement, policy overhaul, and her using her platform to fight back. That's where the transformation begins. Here's the 650-word turning scandal into change section, maintaining the emotional and racial justice alignment while pushing the story into the action phase without losing momentum. By the next morning, my decision was made. There would be no quiet memos, no whispered internal matters. This was going to be addressed in the open, where everyone could see it. I called an all-staff emergency meeting. No one was exempt. Nurses, receptionists, surgeons, administrators, every person employed in that hospital received the same directive: report to the main auditorium at 9 a.m. When I walked onto the stage, the room went still. Rows upon rows of eyes tracked me, some wary, some curious, some already bracing for what was coming. I didn't waste time on introductions. Yesterday, I began, I walked into this hospital for a scheduled prenatal checkup. I was told I didn't belong here. A murmur moved through the crowd, then faded just as quickly. I was denied entry to my own facility, not because I lacked an appointment, not because there was an emergency, but because assumptions were made about who I am, and those assumptions came from the color of my skin and the fact that I'm pregnant. Silence. The kind that feels heavy. I scanned the room. The receptionist, the guard, the nurse, absent as they were already on leave pending investigation. But their colleagues were here, shifting in their seats, some avoiding my gaze, others holding it in defiance or shame. This isn't a misunderstanding, I continued. This is bias. And bias in healthcare kills. I announced the first step. New anti-bias protocols, effective immediately. Every member of staff, regardless of position, would undergo mandatory racial sensitivity training. Not a one-hour slideshow. Real, in-depth education, led by experts with lived experience. The second step, an anonymous reporting system for patients and staff to document discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. Reports would be reviewed by an independent equity committee with the power to recommend disciplinary action. Third, partnerships with national advocacy groups working toward equitable maternal health care. Our facilities would serve as pilot sites for programs designed to reduce Black maternal mortality rates. I could see the shock on some faces, the relief on others. Change, especially in institutions this size, usually came slowly. This would not. By the afternoon, word had leaked beyond our walls. Local reporters began calling. By the end of the day, my communications team had drafted a statement. I read it once, crossed out the safe language, and replaced it with truth. This incident is a clear example of racial bias in healthcare. It will not be excused, minimized, or ignored. We are committed to dismantling the structures that allow it to persist. Within 48 hours, the story was national news. Headlines ran alongside clips from my press conference. Editorials debated the scope of the problem. I was invited to speak on 2 major morning shows. Sitting under the studio lights, I didn't temper my words. Racism in healthcare doesn't just hurt feelings. It costs lives. Every delay in care, every assumption about pain tolerance, every time a woman is ignored, the price is measured in funerals. The response was immediate. My inbox filled with thousands of messages. Some were from patients sharing their own experiences, heartbreakingly similar to mine. Others came from healthcare professionals who admitted they'd witnessed bias and stayed silent. And then there were the calls from other CEOs. Some offered support, others sought guidance. A few, in hushed tones, admitted their own facilities faced similar issues and feared what might happen if they were exposed. I told each of them the same thing. Exposure isn't the risk. Silence is. The scandal had started as an insult. It was becoming a movement, and I wasn't about to let it lose momentum. If you'd like, I can now take this directly into the community impact section, where we show how the changes ripple outward. Patients responding, staff attitudes shifting, and the narrator finding personal resolve before the closing act. This will keep the emotional climb going. Here's the 550-word community impact section, keeping the racial justice focus strong and carrying the momentum forward without softening the emotional stakes. The week after the changes were announced, the letters began to arrive. Some came in plain envelopes, others typed on neat stationery, still others scrawled in uneven handwriting on notebook paper. They came from my city, from across the state, and from places I'd never visited. One read, "I was ignored in the ER until my condition got worse. They said I was exaggerating. I ended up in surgery. I wish someone had fought for me like you did." Another came from a mother of 3. "I stopped going to the clinic after they made me wait for hours, while everyone else was called ahead of me. I thought that was just how it was." The words carried pain, but also relief, because someone had finally said aloud what they'd been living with in silence. Inside the hospital, the shift was quieter, but no less significant. A nurse I barely knew approached me in the hallway. "I didn't agree with everything at first," she admitted, her voice low. "But you were right. We needed this." Another staff member left a handwritten note on my desk. "Thank you for making us better." I was scared, but I'm proud now. Even those who had feared the changes were starting to see that accountability wasn't an attack, it was a protection. Meanwhile, I kept my own care close to home. My prenatal checkups were now handled by a physician I trusted implicitly. Someone who didn't see me as a case file or a headline, but as a patient deserving of care without question. The difference was palpable. I didn't sit in the waiting room calculating how long it would take before someone noticed me. I didn't feel the subtle weight of being assessed for belonging. I was simply cared for. And that's when the truth struck me with new force. What I now felt in those appointments, safety, trust, respect, wasn't a privilege. It should be the standard. For everyone, everywhere. I found myself thinking often about my daughter, about the moment she would open her eyes for the first time, about the first time she'd get sick, the first time she'd need a doctor, the first time someone might look at her and decide she didn't belong. She would be born into a world that tries to decide her worth for her before she can speak it for herself. My job was to make sure that effort failed. Every time. The fight wasn't finished. If anything, it was only just beginning. But change was already taking root, in letters from patients, in conversations in hospital corridors, in the cautious but growing trust of people who had learned to expect the worst. And I intended to keep that change alive, until the day stories like mine were no longer possible. If you'd like, I can now move directly into the closing and call to action section, where the emotional payoff peaks, the message lands hard, and the audience is given a reason to stay engaged with Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Here's the 400-word closing and call to action section, ending the story with emotional weight, full alignment to the racism theme, and a natural but powerful CTA. 2 months later, I walked through the same lobby where it had all happened. The marble floor gleamed under the morning light. At the front desk, a new receptionist looked up immediately, her smile warm, her tone welcoming. "Good morning, and congratulations," she said, nodding toward the small bundle in my arms. The security guard on duty stepped forward, not to block my path, but to open the door to the elevator. No hesitation, no side glances, just simple respect. It wasn't perfection. It was progress. As I rode up to my office, I thought about the journey from that morning. The humiliation, the confrontation, the changes that followed. Titles, wealth, influence. None of it had shielded me from being profiled in my own hospital. Power isn't just in a title. It's in what you do when no one thinks you have it. Later that afternoon, I stood in the nursery holding my daughter against my chest. Her breathing was soft and steady, her tiny fingers curled around mine. I whispered a promise she couldn't yet understand. You will never be invisible in the spaces you belong. In that moment, I knew. This fight was never just for me, it was for her. For every woman who had been told, in words or in silence, that she was less. The screen fades to black. A quote appears in white lettering, "Justice is what love looks like in public, Cornell West." And now I'll say this to you, stories like mine happen every day. Most never make the news. They're endured quietly behind closed doors by people who are told to stay calm, to move on, to not make it a big deal. If you faced something like this or witnessed it, share your story in the comments. Let's make sure no one faces this alone. And if you believe in holding power accountable, in shining a light on injustice until it can't hide anymore, subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. We're just getting started. Would you like me to now compile all sections we've completed into a single continuous final script, ready for narration, so it flows seamlessly from start to finish? That way, you'll have your full 45-minute racism story polished and ready to record.